Greetings and welcome to podcast.init, news, views, and reviews on Python and the people who use it. I'm Tobias Macy.
And I'm Chris Petty. In this first episode, we'd like to briefly introduce the show, who we are, where we're coming from, and what we hope to bring to the table in the coming episodes. Tobias, why don't you start us off with a bit about you?
Thank you, Chris. I'm a software and systems engineer, currently living and working in northern New Hampshire for a startup based in Boston. I also do freelance work on the side, and when I'm not working or hacking on side projects, I like to go on adventures with my family. You can find me on Twitter at Tobias Macy, or you can read my blog at renaissancedev.com.
Wow, you got a lot going on. I'm a senior software engineer for a Boston-based online backup company, and I live in Somerville. I'm a process automation junkie and have been for 25 years. Lately, I've been loving my work in infrastructure as code space using tools like Chef, Ruby, and most recently Python. You can find me on Twitter as @Feoh, that's Feoh, or read my blog at feoh.org.
We realize that while there are innumerable podcasts available that address a wide swath of the software engineering landscape, there was a glaring absence of any that covered Python. The few that we did find are no longer producing any new content, so we decided that it was our duty to the community to remedy the situation. Starting now, at least once a month, we'll be bringing you news and opinions on the Python ecosystem and interviews with the people who are working on the front lines, building the tools and toys that we use every day. Chris, why don't you tell us a bit about what you like so much about Python and maybe some of the tools that you particularly like to take advantage of?
Yeah, sure. So, I've been a Rubyist, a scripter in general for many years. I started out writing shell scripts back in the dark ages with, dinosaurs roaming the earth, and moved on to Perl. And so a real, modern dynamic object-oriented language like Ruby was like a breath of fresh air. And fast forward quite a number of years working for my current gig, and they introduced me to Python. And, it's really... I kind of feel like the sort of partisanship involved in the two camps is unfortunate because both languages are awesome and have a tremendous amount to bring to the table. There's a lot going on in each ecosystem that really is to be played with and recommended. I think a couple of things that I'm really impressed with in the Python space are Ipython Notebook. There's nothing like it that I've seen in the rest of computing, really, in the sense that, you can create all these amazing interactive presentations or classes or whatever and share them around. And it's, they're so accessible. It's a web browser, so virtually anybody can get to it. It's just an amazing tool. And I really like the various Python modes that go with Vim. The Vim rope, or pardon me, I believe it's rope Vim mode and things like that. It really makes for, it's just an editor. It's not an IDE, but it makes for an incredibly rich programming environment.
Great. Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you about the sort of zealousness that goes along with a lot of programming communities, and particularly the some of the shots that are fired across the bow between Python and Ruby. Although I have noticed a lot of times too where both communities like to borrow ideas from each other. For instance, there's the whole idea of the gherkin format and cucumber behavior-driven development that seems to have started mainly in the Ruby camp has definitely come over to the Python side. I've seen it in a few places, and I actually recently came across a tool called, I believe it was called Pundler, that is a Python version of Bundler, essentially.
That's really cool.
Yeah, gives you a really sort of a different approach to managing your dependencies than our typical virtual envs that takes a lot of ideas from Bundler and seems to do a pretty good job of executing on that. I will say one of the things that I do love the most about Python is the really strong focus on being explicit in what you're doing, particularly in terms of namespacing. That's one thing that I found somewhat lacking in the Ruby communities, or the Ruby programming language, is the namespacing capabilities leave a bit to be desired. So sometimes it can be somewhat easy to pollute your namespace, whereas in Python there's a very strong focus on making sure that every time you are dealing with something that is brought into your namespace, you can fairly easily go back and see where it came from and see what things might possibly be overriding it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the name spacing thing is a definite issue. It's interesting that you point out the explicitness of Python. As a longtime Rubyist coming to Python, that's one of the things that actually kind of threw me initially was like even something as simple as lack of implicit returns. Some of the people that we worked with at our last, or well, not, I guess not our last, but at the previous gig that we worked together on, really had sort of inculcated me into this idea, this almost school of thought that code should read, almost like English and be very, very terse, and functions should be as small as they possibly can. And Python really kind of rejects that wholesale. Coming to Python and trying to write little functions is something as simple as, can you find this substring in another string? And if you don't put the return in, the function's not going to do what you want, and you're going to get none back. And as a Rubyist, that really took me by surprise. But I can totally see the advantages to being explicit. It's real. One of the things I think people should really consider. There's been a lot of talk lately about, if you're going to learn another language and you're a Rubyist, you should go learn Clojure or Haskell or something. And those are awesome languages, and you definitely should. But I think sometimes even just sort of going for a dive into a completely different idiom can be really mind expanding and instructive as well.
Yeah, definitely an agreement there. There's definitely a lot to be learned by learning a language that has a totally different take on how to go about doing things. Another thing I'll say I do love a lot about Python is some of the conventions in terms of managing your code layout itself, particularly PEP8, really makes it easier to get into, to just jump into a new code base without having to try and figure out, okay, what is the particular style guide that this person decided to adhere to.
Yeah, I totally agree. PEP8 is great. I really do love it. The one kind of beef I have with PEP8 is I think an 80 character line limit just makes it really tough. If you're using, nice descriptive variable names and, at all complex literal data structures, it can get to the point where it's like I'm doing yoga with my source code to get it to fit into the 80 character line limit. So at my shop, we've decided that 120 characters is a more reasonable stance to take.
Yeah, so that's what we've settled on where I'm working right now as well. We're focusing on trying to maintain 120 character limit, although I will say that having the 80 character line lengths, well, it can sometimes become a little bit difficult to try and manage keeping it within that limit. A lot of times it can actually be a good guide as well to letting you know when you should sort of refactor a function, because if you're starting to nest things so deeply that you can't stay within 80 characters, then it suggests maybe you should break some of that out into separate functions so that it's easier to reason about.
That's very true. It's kind of funny. It's something that I've learned being in the business for as many years as I have. Is what's old is new. I can't help but think back to who's the guy who invented Forth? I can't remember his name at the moment. It might be Charles Moore actually, talking about how all your Forth words should be no more than a screen in length. It's kind of like keep things short, keep things concise, keep things very sort of minimalistic. That idea really seems to carry a lot of weight and be applicable as we move forward into newer and higher level languages.
Yep. Yeah, and one thing too that PEP8 seems to foster is shorter names for things, whereas in Ruby and particularly in Java, a lot of the names can become very verbose, whereas in Python, I generally have noticed that the names are a bit shorter. And I think part of that is to adhere to PEP8 so that you're not taking up a huge portion of your line just in the name of a variable or a method call.
You know what though, I have to say I don't. I mean, and maybe this is just a matter of I'm still relatively new to Python. I've only been using it for about 6 months, but I think descriptive variable names are a good thing. Like, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've been staring at source code and I see this thing that says like PTR, and it's like, well, what the heck is a PTR? And especially in a dynamic language like Python, I feel like, or Ruby for that matter, I feel like really descriptive variable names are an asset. But again, maybe that's because I haven't fully, fully partaken of the Kool-Aid, and maybe I'll come around. I don't know.
I'm totally in agreement with you about the utility of descriptive variable names. It's just that I find that in Python, people generally employ a lot more abbreviation in those names. So, yes, it can occasionally become confusing as to what people are intending to refer to, but It's just one of those dangers of working in the world that we work in. Uh, Another thing that I really like about Python is the strong focus on documentation, particularly the fact that the language itself has capabilities built in to very easily document what methods, to add documentation to methods, and there's a very strong convention around the syntax that you should use for stating, in particular, what the inputs of a function are and what the expected return values. And then also another really great add-on to that is the whole doc test module, where you can actually write some simplistic tests inline in your documentation, so it serves dual duty as both an example of how to use a particular method, but then it also lets you go back and use that same documentation to validate that the method is doing what it's supposed to do without necessarily having to pull that out into a separate unit test, although you should certainly do that as well.
No, I definitely totally agree. I think that's one of the big problems with the Ruby community is this whole sort of mantra of use the source, Luke. It's like it's fine, but when you find yourself hip deep in a really mature Ruby module or gem, it can be really, really hard to figure out what's going on. Like I remember in particular at the job we both worked at, I was trying to use a particular feature of fog, which is an awesome Ruby gem for working with cloud functionality, and I couldn't understand how it was trying to work, and the people that we worked with at the time were just like, well, just go read the source, and I'm sitting there staring at this source, and I totally agree with you. The fact that not only does Python provide really strong documentation support, but all the tooling around it really sort of like basically will even tell you, hey, you didn't have a doc string in there in that method, so it really makes it easy, and you're goaded into making your workflow include that. And I think that's such a huge help to provide that kind of crumb trail for programmers who might want to use your work going forward. I totally agree. That's definitely a feature, no question.
Yeah. Yeah, and having it in line with the code as well makes it a lot easier to prevent it from drifting away from what the actual code is doing, because if you're working in the method, it becomes almost trivial to just scroll up a little ways and edit the doc string as well, since you're already in the source. So rather than having it as in a separate file, or even just having it above the method definition, sometimes can just make it seem a little bit more separate. Whereas because the documentation starts at the line just below the def of what the function or class name is, it just really encourages you to think of it as one unit, both the documentation and the code.
Exactly. Totally agree. Shall we move on to picks?
Sure. Yeah, so I'd like to thank everyone for staying with us through our introductory episode. And as Chris mentioned, now we're going to go to some picks. So, Chris, why don't you start us off?
Okay, I'm going to borrow the convention from Avdi Grimm, one of the Ruby rogues. I totally have to give them a shout out because, as far as I'm concerned, they are watching them evolve from the beginning to where they are today. I've kind of learned a lot about how to, what I like in building a technical podcast. And so I'll have one tech pick and one non-tech pick. My tech pick is a tool that was released without much fanfare, but that when I saw it, I was kind of blown away, and I thought, this is something I really want to explore. It's called Petey Python, and we will have the links for these tools up on the episode page when we get that up. What's kind of amazing about it is it's kind of like a better Ipython. It has all the interactive capabilities of Ipython, and in fact even has an Ipython compatibility mode, so you can use all your tooling and such with it. But what's amazing about it is that it provides almost IDE-like curses-based object method and etc., all the good completion goodies, so that as you're typing, you don't have to get the exact name of something right. You can just hit tab or whatever, and boom, you have a nice curses completion list up there to help you get to the right place. And that's just scratching the surface. It has a tremendous number of really great, innovative, interactive features, and it's just a great interactive tool. And I really think that having a rich REPL to play around in is one of the really awesome things about dynamic languages. I cannot tell you how amazing it is after working in languages like Java, where until very recently you could not just pop into a prompt and try out some expressions. Like that is my workflow. When I'm trying to understand how to build something, or even trying to understand how to use other people's code, I need to be able to just like pull it in, pop it up, and sort of try and a few invocations to see like what parameters does it want to take, what does it do, how does it behave. That kind of Play-Doh phase, as I like to call it, is a really it's something I find very hard to live without, and Petey Python just makes it a joy. So my non-technical pick, I'm going to pick a beer because I like good beer, and so I'm going to pick Duchess de Bourgogne. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that quite right. It's spelled Bourgogne. It's the Burgundy region, and it's considered to be a Flemish sour. I like sour beers because for a long time I sort of, like most people, tried the traditional sort of like what we'd seen: porters, stouts, IPAs, and the like, and lagers and ales, obviously. And the sour is just a completely different animal. It is what it says. It is a sour flavor, but to say that it's not like sucking on a lemon, there's a tremendous amount of complexity there. It's like a little bit sweet, a little bit fruity. It just has a tremendous amount of depth. And I really recommend it. If you're an open-minded person and you like good beer and you're looking to try something new, it's definitely worth hunting down. It's even good. It's even full-bodied and strong enough that it can take being bottled. So if you aren't lucky enough to live in a city and have a beer establishment near you that will serve it on tap, the bottle is certainly a fine way to give it a try. And I really like it. It's my favorite sour beer that I've ever tried. There's been a couple of others that I also enjoyed, but the majority of them that I encounter are kind of one note. They are sour, which is nice, but they lack that sort of depth and complexity that the Duchess provides. And I think that's it for me.
Great. I'm going to second your pick on Petey Python. I came across that recently, and I've been using it a bit, and it definitely is a superb REPL. I've been a long-time user of Ipython as my standard REPL when I'm doing development, and Petey Python really just takes that up a notch and just adds some extra utility to what Ipython already offered. So thank you for bringing that one up. So my picks this time are going to be, to start with, there's a database management tool called dbeaver that I started using. I use Linux on my machine at home and for work, and for a long time I've been hunting for a really good cross-database, just GUI tool to work in so that I could not necessarily have to tie myself to using pgadmin when I'm using Postgres or the MySQL admin when I'm using MySQL. Just having one tool that'll let me connect to a number of different databases without, one that's free and open source and one that isn't hamstrung by an open core kind of model. And dbeaver just really has everything that I could ever want. So I'll have the link to that in the show notes. Another tool.
Oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
But dbeaver, that's really funny that you would mention that tool because I'm mostly a Mac guy, but lately at work, I just sort of, the company that I'm working for now is largely a Linux and Windows shop. And so my desktop at work is a Linux box. And sort of I've been sort of like moving in there, adjusting the drapes and figuring out where all the furniture is and how I like things. And one of the things that I had been struggling with is, the shop, we were a Windows shop before my group came in and started transitioning things to Linux. And so they have a tremendous number of Microsoft SQL Server databases. And dbeaver is one of the only cross-platform clients that let me work with that as well as the MySQL databases that we use. So that's very cool. I like it as well. I think it's a really good tool. And now that I really used to like Aqua Data Studio, but now that's gone commercial and a pretty hefty price tag, like $500 a license or something. So
Yep.
dbeaver is great. Definitely second that.
Yeah, I used to use Aqua Data Studio as well at a previous job where they paid for the license, but yeah, having an open source offering that really has a lot of really good functionality and the capability to attach to a large number of databases, including even MongoDB and I believe Cassandra as well.
Oh, cool.
Just, yeah, really great tool. Another thing that I've been using recently is a tool called Kde Connect. So it's both a desktop application for the KDE desktop environment and an Android application. And what it does is it lets you link up your desktop and your Android device whenever they're on the same wireless network so that you can actually get notifications from your device that show up in your desktop notification panel. It lets you have two-way copy paste between devices, so I can copy something on my desktop and then paste it into something on my tablet. It also lets you use your tablet as a essentially as a trackpad, so you can use your tablet to move your mouse around and click on things. You can also use your tablet to type on your computer. So it's just a really great, really interesting tool from the folks who build KDE. Who, if you're not using KDE and have never tried it, I definitely recommend that you at least take a look, particularly in its latest incarnation with the with the new Plasma 5 desktop. Really slick.
Oh, I totally agree. As a matter of fact, you may have seen me sort of ranting and whining and piteously flailing on Twitter when I first tried to set my desktop up with Linux again. It's been a long time since I've worked on the Linux desktop. Like, just to give you a sense, I think the last Linux desktop I ran had FVWM, I think, as it was back when they weren't desktops, only window managers, and like that's the way we rolled. So I installed stock Unity on my Ubuntu on my box, and they have their own desktop manager. I think it's Unity actually.
Yep.
And I really applaud the way the direction they're trying to go in with it. I think it's a really great tool, but it just lacks so much of the polish that the KDE folks have really put into play with their desktop. Particularly, I'm partially blind, so the handicap accessibility features are absolutely critical for me. And I was finding myself really struggling with things like I can't adjust the system fonts for the icons or the menu items or anything for that matter, or the desktops. I'm sitting here dealing with massive eye strain issues by the end of the day because I can't see the tools that I'm trying to work with. And KDE is just, man, their stuff is slicker than snot, to use a perhaps somewhat raunchy phrase. Like, everything is configurable right down to the nines. It's very clear and straightforward most of the time how to get everything to work within the desktop itself. And I've been loving it. The only thing that I will say, and this is less to do about KDE and more to do about Linux, is I still feel like the Linux community needs to agree upon a standard for like app and desktop interoperability. Something as silly as, okay, I listen to Spotify all day most of the time, and I would love to be able to find a way to, from wherever I am, control the volume of my Spotify client and be able to like fast forward and rewind songs and the like. Doing that on the Mac is super trivial because of AppleScript. As much of an ugly duckling as it is, it really is like duct tape. It binds the entire Apple environment together, and you can control virtually anything with anything with it. And so you get these awesome tools like Quicksilver and Alfred, and I can make my entire environment hum to the tune that I want it to, and it's really trivial. But under the Linux world, it was kind of a spelunking expedition to figure out if it was even possible. And when I got it to work, it was a great deal of effort. So I feel like they've come a long way. KDE especially is just amazing, and I wish that they would go that extra 15 yards to cross the finish line. They could make the Linux desktop into a really amazing environment that I could recommend without any caveats at all.
Sure. And that sort of leads me to a bonus pick. There's a library called Player Control, PlayerCTL, that lets you really easily bind media keys to play, pause, stop, next track, and backtrack actions that will actually execute on Spotify. So that's what I use on my desktop for controlling the playback of Spotify when I'm listening to it.
Nice. I will definitely check that out, because I got to admit, like, it's so hard. I'm sitting there at work and I'm working away and I'm in my editor and someone walks over and it's like, well, hold on, I have to pause my music and I have to like flail for the for the app and the right everything, when really I just want to be able to hit a key. So I will check that out. Thank you.
Yep. And so for my last pick today, I'm going to go with a non-technical pick. There's a board game I picked up a little while ago and have had a chance to play a few times called Summoner Wars. And for anyone who hasn't heard of it, my best way to describe it is somewhat of a cross between Magic the Gathering and chess.
Oh wow.
So the way that it works is you have different decks that correspond to different factions, and you play it on a physical board. So you place the cards on the board. Each deck has a certain setup that it begins with, and then there's a summoner for each faction, which is essentially the king in the chess analogy. So the object of the game is to destroy the opponent's summoner, and in order to do so, you have units that you can move around the board that have the ability to attack. Some of them are ranged units, some of them require to be adjacent to the unit they're attacking. And there are also effect cards, which add effects. For instance, one effect might limit the movement capability that your opponent has on their next turn. So rather than being able to move 2 spaces with a unit card, they can only move 1. So it's just a really interesting combination of game styles, and it's really well executed. They've also done a good job of adding some expandability to it with additional factions that you can purchase to add some variety to the gameplay. So definitely worth checking out. And again, we'll put the links to that in the show notes.
That sounds awesome.
So that is all I have for picks for today. So Chris, I would like to thank you very much for joining me, and everyone who's listening, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to us ramble on for a bit. And we will be back as soon as possible with our next episode. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, we've got some great ideas in the incubator, and hopefully we'll be back soon with some interviews and a more fully stocked episode the way we hope to run them. Thanks a bunch, folks.